just a little something to whet your appetites that I think is so important, and it's why I think the American Civil War is still the most profound part of American history. It's why we are the United States today. Mark Twain observed that the Civil War was uprooted institutions that were centuries old, changed the politics of a people, transformed the social life of half the country, and wrought so profoundly upon the entire national character that the influence cannot be measured short of 2 or 3 generations. Well, nearly 6 generations later, Americans continue to reflect upon the enormity of the conflict that divided the country and almost severed it forever. But have we gotten it right? I'd like to think so. Do we still have a long way to go? I know so. There's so much more to study and comprehend, not only the battle, but also reconciling ourselves with the imperfect past. Reconstruction in our country's history is known as the unfinished revolution, and it brilliantly challenges us to truly understand what the war was about, how it shaped the post-war years, how it initially succeeded, and how it ultimately failed. Civil War scholar Eric Foner stated the war and Reconstruction are a part of our lives even today. Issues that agitate American politics, who is an American citizen and what rights come along with citizenship, the relative powers of the national government and the states, affirmative action, the relationship between political and economic democracy, the proper response to even terrorism are Reconstruction questions. Reconstruction is embedded in our judicial process. Every session of the Supreme Court adjudicates issues arising from the 14th Amendment and the civil rights legislation of Reconstruction. So with that, we need to look beyond our battlefields and visit the stories of our deep wounds, the fertile hopes, and unrealized potential to transcend our ideal of memorialization to fact. So let's today have candid conversations that promote productive dialogue and reconciliation, because in my opinion, that's why the Civil War still matters. So with that, I will turn it over to Mr. John Lynn.
Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Some of you might think it very brave of John Mather to book an Englishman to lecture you on the overall strategy of the American Civil War, but I hope you'll agree that it's much braver of me to actually accept that invitation. So let me reassure you that I've been a student of this war for 50 years or so, and with a group of friends from England, I've visited over 100 Civil War battlefields in 10 states. And today I wear the tie and the pin of the American Civil War Roundtable United Kingdom branch. Okay? And I should perhaps just warn you that my choice of shirt today is not accidental. Okay? So let us begin with a survey of the contending parties and the strategic issues of the war which will begin to emerge. In February 1861, 7 states seceded from the Union: South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, in that order, the Deep South. After the attack on Fort Sumter and Lincoln's call for volunteers to suppress the rebellion in April, 4 more states seceded: Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, bringing 11 states in all. The Confederacy will claim 2 more states, which it never, of course, actually controlled: Missouri and Kentucky. But that's probably just to make a nice even pattern on the Stars and Bars flag. Now, the first capital was Montgomery, Alabama. Now, with hindsight, it might have been better to have left it there, because moving it to Richmond, Virginia in May 1861 created a sort of stalemate situation in the East, which was worthy of the First World War. But we mustn't try and use hindsight to understand what was going on. We must try and understand it in the terms of the day. Because this new country, whether you agree it was in rebellion or not, had a remarkably strong grip on its territory at the very start of the war. I mean, better than any other Civil War situation I can think in world history. It has a population of some 9 million. Its immediate problem, of course, is that 39% of that population, 3.5 million people, are human beings kept in chattel slavery. Of the 5.5 million free whites, only 6%, some 350,000 people, own any slaves of any description. So this is always going to be a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. And if we allow that 52% of the white population were males of military age, the feeling of about 1 million soldiers is a very remarkable achievement of the Confederacy. The South is overwhelmingly agricultural and heavily dependent on 2 cash crops: cotton and tobacco. In the whole of the South, there are only 18,000 factories, employing about 100,000 people. It only has about 30% of the railroads. It has a coastline of 3,000 miles and a land border with the north of some 1,800 miles. President Jefferson Davis states his war aims very clearly from the start. We seek no conquest, no aggrandizement, no concession of any kind from the states with which we were lately confederated. All we ask is to be left alone. So the secession was to defend states' rights. They're not fighting to defend the right to hold slaves, because that was not officially challenged in the American Constitution anyway. But the right to extend slavery into new states was a constant bone of contention, firmly resisted by the North. There had been political crises over the extending of slavery in 1819, throughout the 1830s, which is when the abolition movement gets going, in 1846, 1849, 1850, and numerous sort of compromises in between. So, this is the issue really of what the war's about. The United States of America retains the loyalty of 21 states, to which 2 more will be added in the course of the war. And it, of course, has a free population of 21 million. It only needed to field armies of about 2.5 million from that total during the course of the war. It has over 100,000 factories, and it outproduces the South by 30 to 1 in war materials. It has 70% of America's railroads, and its war aims are simply to force the rebellious states to return to the Union. And as I said and I stressed, slavery was not an issue in the war at this particular early stage. Notoriously, in August 1862, Lincoln said that if it would restore the Union, he would leave the peculiar institution entirely untouched. But this issue will force itself onto the agenda of the war. The South was desperate to win foreign recognition. The France of Napoleon III was very keen to recognise it, but only if Great Britain followed suit. Now, the ruling elite in Britain was sympathetic to the South. It recognised the Confederacy as a belligerent power, which meant it was allowed to trade with Europe. But it had to prove to get full state recognition. It could only be granted if the Confederacy proved its right to exist by force of arms. So it was not enough for David to defend himself against Goliath. There was a very great moral indignation against slavery amongst the general population in Europe, which would keep the British government in check. The Confederacy thought that cotton was king, of course, and it overplayed its hand by imposing a total embargo on the export of cotton. It hoped to reduce the factory-based economies of Britain and France to ruin and then oblige those countries to recognise the Confederacy and end the Union blockade. Some 400,000 factory operatives were thrown out of work in Britain in particular, but by the later crusading nature of the war, and also the wholesale switch to India and Egypt as a source of cotton, frustrated this Confederate gamble. It was a real gamble they took, banning the export of cotton, and it backfired on them very badly. What became to be sure was that neither side was expecting such a bitter 4-year war as they actually got. And the strategic dilemma for each side was quite different. The North has just to force the rebellious states to return to the Union. Okay, that means invading 750,000 square miles of enemy territory. The Union has mastery of the sea, of course, and it opposes a blockade, which leaks like a sieve, but gradually it'll increase the stranglehold on the South from every point of the compass. The South has declared that it just wants to be left alone. After having taken the momentous step to secede, each state, of course, expects to be defended from northern aggression. So do they stand on a pure defensive, letting the world, for which Britain and France see them as David fighting off Goliath? That invites the North to just steamroll them at will. So is it viable to stand on the defensive and keep inflicting as many casualties on the invaders until their peoples will lose heart and call a halt to the war? I hardly need to tell an American audience that your football coaches insist the best defence is a good offence. That's the audience would be there. But here's the problem. Now, striking back at the North incurs 2 problems immediately. First of all, many Southerners intent on defending their own state autonomy have a moral problem in violating another state's autonomy. A lot of Southerners didn't like invading the North. Second, if you concentrate your armies to make a meaningful strike force, you strip away defenders from the peripheral and vulnerable states and leave them wondering whether secession was such a good idea in the first place. the absence of a true grand strategy is the fatal weakness in the Confederacy. It will also find that a confederacy is not a union. Okay? So states that seceded to defend themselves against a tyrannical central government will very soon find themselves at war with a Richmond government on a vast range of topics: conscription, finance, suspension of habeas corpus, requisitioning of goods, local defence. I mean, how Georgia never got around to seceding from the Confederate States, I will never understand. So just, like that all the time. The North does have a war-winning strategy from the very, very start, but it will take a couple of years to realise that fact and to make it a reality. Winfield Scott's famous Anaconda Plan clearly showed how vulnerable the South was to encirclement by sea and by land, and how it could be chopped up into sort of bite-sized morsels for Union armies invading from north and from south. And it takes the gifted amateur strategist Abraham Lincoln to finally realise this scheme. So now I'm going to turn to study the course of the war itself, and as I discuss it, you'll see some of these themes working into the narrative. In 1861, the tiny regular army of the USA is in big trouble. The bulk of the men and the Navy stay loyal, but over 300 officers have gone south. Both sides mobilise their state militias. They call for volunteers to join the colours. And there follows a series of sort of scrappy battles carried out by armies. I've got a very great deal to learn about the nature of war in the 1860s. One observer said the South went larking off to war. It was sort of gone with the wind, sort of meaning. All eyes were on the very first great clash in Virginia, the remarkable and wholly unexpected Confederate victory at First Bull Run, or Manassas if you prefer, in July. Straight away hopes soar for foreign recognition, and two plenipotentiaries, Mason and Slidell, are dispatched to Europe. And there's a wave of elation that sweeps the South, sees a huge surge of volunteering, so much so that 200,000 men have to be turned away at the depots for lack of any kind of weapon with which to arm them. But in the North, it sees a stern call for 300,000 men to serve for 3 years. They're obviously taking it very, very seriously. In the vast expanses of the West, the long-term problems of the Confederacy begin to manifest themselves quite early. The Union moves quickly and decisively to keep Missouri and Kentucky out of the Confederacy. Under the command of Albert Sidney Johnston in the West, the Confederacy, very keen on protecting its component states, resorts to what we call a cordon defence line stretching all the way from the Mississippi River to the Appalachian Mountains. They should have remembered the maxim of the great Frederick the Great of Prussia. He said that he who defends everything defends nothing. The year ends with the Union Navy stopping the British ship the Trent on the high seas and arresting Mason and Slidell. This brings Britain closer to declaring war on the United States of America than it ever has done before or since. It was a political genius on the part of Abraham Lincoln to climb down so very quickly, restore the Confederate agents to their liberty, and they then proceeded to Europe with high hopes of securing recognition from friendly governments. The year 1862 begins ominously badly for the South. Further defeats in small battles, and then suddenly the wholesale collapse of that defence line I just described leaves their whole western strategy in ruins. Grant's capture of Forts Henry and Donelson opens up the southern heartlands to invasion along the lines of those great rivers that run from north to south, the Mississippi, the Cumberland, the Tennessee. Only the super cautious Union commanders like Halleck and Don Buell hold back the immediate crisis for the South. When the Confederates finally put together a decent-sized field army, they are met and defeated on the field at Shiloh in April. And in a scenario that repeats itself throughout the war, no amount of truly glorious fighting by Southern troops and by their generals can quite get the better of stubborn Union armies that refuse to recognise defeat when it stares them in the face. So once again, the world's eyes are fixated on the Eastern Theatre. The proximity of the two capitals, Washington and Richmond, acts as a sort of magnet of maximum effort by both sides. There was a long pause after the First Bull Run as both sides mobilised, organised and trained their fresh armies. And then the young Napoleon, George McClellan, uses sea power to convey the Army of the Potomac to the very gates of Richmond by coming up the Yorktown Peninsula. And there, despite the dogged courage of his own troops, Little Mac is paralysed with fear, and he's pounded back by the Army of Northern Virginia, especially once the great Robert E. Lee becomes its commander. And of course, towards the end of 1861, start of 1862, all the one-year regiments that started at the beginning of the war near their end of term of service. So the South is the first to impose conscription on its manpower. And that, of course, starts a great series of internal feuds between states' rights governors and the central government. The Confederate government is raising vast loans at shockingly high rates of interest. In 1861 alone, they raised $165 million in loans at rates of anything between 8 and 12.5%, ruinously high interest. By the end of the war, the Confederacy will have issued $700 million in paper money. And I have to remind you that a Confederate dollar is worth 4 cents federal.
Oh my God.
Think about it. This leads to a war between southern farmers and their own government, with massive concealment of produce and the resort to forced requisitions, and levels of taxation rise dramatically and remorselessly. Let's say they must have been thinking that secession wasn't such a great idea after all. In the east, Lee simply leaves McClellan's armies bottled up at the tip of the peninsula, and then he races north to meet John Pope's army at Second Manassas, and again thrashes the Union army off the field of battle. He now poses a direct threat to the north. He proceeds to invade Maryland, capturing Harper's Ferry en route. The string of victories in the East is doing a great deal to secure international recognition. The British Prime Minister Palmerston privately recorded that 1 or 2 more victories like those in Virginia will make recognition of the Confederacy inevitable. But this last chance ends in total failure. Now we have a Union army fighting on its home turf, aided by the accidental recovery of Lee's entire campaign plan, which I'll tell you about another time if you want. So the Union Army closes the door at South Mountain, and in the bloodiest single day of the entire war, hammers Lee's army at Antietam, or Sharpsburg, and forces it to retreat back into Virginia. Now, most significantly, this gives Lincoln the chance to publish his Emancipation Proclamation, declaring all slaves in the rebellious states to be free. And when this passes into law on the 1st of January 1863, the nature of the war fundamentally changes, and foreign recognition of the Confederate States becomes absolutely impossible. In the West, things are going from bad to worse. New Orleans falls to the Union quite early in the year, and a drive from south to north along the Mississippi is getting underway. All the Confederate positions north of Vicksburg fall, and that last stronghold is threatened from both sides. Confederate attempts to regain the initiative end in defeats at Iuka, Corinth, and at Perryville. And again, the year ends with another defeat. I mean, a defeat literally snatched from the jaws of victory at Stones River, which you might call Murfreesboro Bay. But here's the thing. 1862 ends with 2 stunning defensive victories by the Confederacy at Fredericksburg and at Chickasaw Bluffs. Now, this is either a cruel twist of fate, or it might be an indicator of how the war should be fought from here on. In 1863, in the East, there is no let-up in the pressure from the Army of the Potomac, which is now, of course, camped permanently in northern Virginia. But even poor old Ambrose Burnside, who'd been hounded by Washington into that disastrous attack at Fredericksburg, one of the worst conducted battles in military history, shows he's got some spirit by trying to turn Lee's army out of its winter lines in January. This produces the infamous Mud March, which ruins Burnside's reputation completely. But the next commander, Fighting Joe Hooker, also devises a perfectly sound plan to turn Lee out of Fredericksburg by sidestepping to the right. And in what must be Lee's greatest tactical achievement, he divides his army not once but twice in the presence of the enemy, which is supposed to be a cardinal sin, and of course routs Hooker on the field at Chancellorsville. Chancellorsville, of course, sees the death of Stonewall Jackson, a grievous loss to Robert E. Lee. I just want to slip in here. I want to paraphrase something said by a Union general about Stonewall Jackson. He said, and I feel that Jackson and the Southern fighting man in general deserved a nobler cause in which to sacrifice themselves. So it's a very interesting idea. In the West, things do not go well for the Confederacy. The Mississippi Valley was being conquered from south and from north. Confederate states west of the river are beyond all help by now. A huge Union army then strikes down into Middle Tennessee, aiming for Chattanooga. And this Tullahoma campaign, very largely unstudied, there are no spectacular battles to attract our attention, but it is the solid basis for the final Union victory. The Union coming down into Tennessee, getting a grip on it and not letting go. It is absolutely decisive, I think, in the Civil War. The Loyalist Union areas of East Tennessee, of course, are in safe hands. And every Confederate commander in the West is clamoring for reinforcements, but there's very little cooperation between the various field armies and garrisons in the West. The commander-in-chief in the West, Joe Johnston, does not have the backing of Jefferson Davis. He's got his own set of special friends, chief amongst them Braxton Bragg, a very controversial commander indeed. And all of them are under a relentless and grinding pressure from the Union, but also from their own government in Richmond. One interesting development is the striking success of large bodies of Confederate cavalry raiding deep into Northern held territory in the West. Now, this was never going to defeat the Union Army, but it did make them very, very nervous. It forced them to leave up to a third or more of their strength guarding their lines of communication. And of course, Grant's first major thrust against Vicksburg had to be entirely abandoned when his main depot at Holly Springs went up in flames at the hands of Confederate cavalry. So again, is this a possibility for the South? If you just keep dragging the war out, making it ever more expensive for the North to maintain? A very important debate arises now. So given in the East, you've got this high force ratio against space available for manoeuvre, which makes the East a completely deadlocked military zone. And the idea arises that whether the unconquerable Lee could stand on the defensive there and release some of his superb veterans for a grand offensive in the West. Old Pete Longstreet was a very keen advocate of this proposal to launch a counter-offensive out of Tennessee, across the Ohio River, turn west and cut Grant off in the Mississippi Valley completely. Richmond was edging towards that idea when Lee comes along and pours cold water on it. He's absolutely convinced that Union strategy for the year would focus again on Virginia and Richmond. As it happened, he was quite wrong on that score, but he demands freedom of action to invade the North via Maryland and Pennsylvania. Lee told Davis, "There is nothing to be gained by this army of Northern Virginia remaining quietly on the defensive. We cannot afford to keep our troops awaiting possible movements of the enemy. Our true policy is so to employ our own forces as to give occupation to his forces at points of our selection." Well, I would agree with that generally, but how about doing that in the West instead of in the East? A high consideration was the utterly destitute condition of Virginia itself. The Army of Northern Virginia could at least feed itself on the lush Pennsylvania countryside and give Virginia a bit of a breather. And perhaps a direct threat on a great northern city like Baltimore or Washington might make the North think again. What to do about the Army of the Potomac once it had followed Lee up to the North and how to fight it in the North is a debate that's going to go on forever and forever. We all know that this leads to the Battle of Gettysburg and 3 days of violent attacks by Lee on one of the most stubborn armies that the world has ever seen, the Army of the Potomac. But a good principle of strategic offensive and a tactical defensive was abandoned, and it leads to a very heavy defeat for the South. The Army of Northern Virginia goes home laden with supplies that will sustain it for months and months, and then it checkmates the Union Army for the rest of the year. Meanwhile, in the Mississippi Valley is completely closed by the conquest of Vicksburg and Port Hudson, and Union armies now gather their strength before resuming the offensive wherever they choose. Longstreet gets his chance. He brings 2 superb divisions from the Army of Northern Virginia to join Braxton Bragg's army. And the Battle of Chickamauga, another of those spectacular Confederate victories that are never quite decisive enough to make a difference. So bottling the Union Army up in Chattanooga simply leads to Grant joining it there. And then that amazing day when the soldiers battle, when the Union troops just decide for themselves, without their generals telling them to, that they were going to get Secesh off Missionary Ridge, whatever it costs, and they do it in the most remarkable way. And the year ends in the West with Longstreet joining a very select club, that is Confederate generals soundly defeated in the field by Ambrose Burnside at Knoxville, Tennessee. Now, having described this terrible year for the Confederacy, and it's very strange to record that 1864 saw a last and a definite possibility of forcing the North to the peace table. The winter sees the South licking its wounds as it watches the North gather its strength in every theatre. We haven't got time to describe all the seaborne expeditions and incursions into southern coastal regions where vast numbers of southern troops are being tied down in local defence. Abraham Lincoln, having hired and fired a succession of generals, finally makes Ulysses S. Grant Commander-in-Chief of all the Union armies in the field, and he devises a total war strategy that will see the South assailed from every possible angle. Grant is a truly modern general, one of the great generals of history. He knows how to handle big issues. With his main Western design in the hands of his soulmate, William Sherman, he can now accompany George Meade's Army of the Potomac as they move on Lee's army and on Richmond. But, and here's the thing, the overland campaign, beginning in May in the wilderness and ending at the siege lines of Petersburg, bring the northern population closer to war-weary exhaustion than anything they've ever experienced so far. The staggering levels of casualties suffered by the Army of the Potomac made many wonder whether it was worth the blood and the treasure it was consuming. There are two things holding it all together. Abraham Lincoln's iron will and those amazing men in blue uniforms. After the hell that was the Battle of Wilderness, the morale of this Union Army soars when Grant, instead of ordering another retreat back to Washington, sends them sidestepping around Lee and on the road towards Richmond. So not the butchery of Spotsylvania Courthouse or the bloody angle or Cold Harbor could ever dampen the spirits of these soldiers. As their 3-year enlistments fell due, these great regiments re-up and veteranise and carry the war forward to its conclusion. Lee fights a truly brilliant defensive campaign. They say that he doesn't manoeuvre his troops, he manoeuvres his trenches, and he gets nearer and nearer to Richmond and holding the Union Army at bay. And he's stretching his ill-clothed, ill-fed and incomparable army to the very limit as it covers Petersburg and Richmond. In the west, Sherman begins a similar advance on Atlanta, Georgia. No amount of temporary defeats or losses will stop him as he grinds closer and closer to that city every day. Joe Johnson in command here now has very few options. He fights very skilled, defensive and delaying battles, and the standing joke even in 1864 was that Joe Johnson will fight his last battle to defend Atlanta in the Florida Keys. They said that even then in 1864. Presidential elections were due in November. The grumbling from the northern press and from politicians grew so loud that even Abe Lincoln began to doubt whether he could win the election in that year. George McClellan, as I said once the darling of the Army of the Potomac, was a powerful peace advocate running for the Northern Democrats. And despite the overall nature of the war, as I've described it so far, things are beginning to look very bright for the South and very dark for the North. Jefferson Davis finally loses patience with Joe Johnson and hands the command at Atlanta to the fiery John Bell Hood, the legendary one-armed, one-legged commander of the Texas Brigade in Lee's army, who'd come west with Longstreet in 63. He decided the only way to defeat Sherman was to attack him vigorously, and he does that and crashes to defeat in a number of days, I mean literally in a handful of days. And the deliverance of Atlanta was the boost that Lincoln and the North needed to see them through these very dark times. So in the elections, the boys in blue vote overwhelmingly for Lincoln. From that moment on, it's only a matter of time before the South is finally defeated. Jubal Early's raid up the Shenandoah Valley might cause a frisson of excitement in Washington, but what it does do is bring Phil Sheridan and 2 spare Army Corps from Virginia crashing down on his head. The valley is soon left of the Confederacy forever. In a last hurrah in the West, as Sherman simply detaches himself from his lines of supply and communication and sets off towards the coast, making Georgia howl along the way, John Bell Hood launches an offensive towards the north. He hoped to draw Sherman's army north with him. That was never going to happen, okay? He still has time to influence the results of the elections, with an outside chance he could have done that. And there was even enough grumbling in the northwestern Union states that briefly threatened to form another confederacy that might have seceded from the Union. And of course we are going to hear in the next talk how this effort by John Bell Hood ends at Franklin and at Nashville. So I won't say more on that. In 1865, these peripheral Union expeditions might still come to grief. Brave Southern troops might still win the minor victories, but nothing was going to stop the Northern juggernaut from winning this war. And it was now a war that sought the complete and utter destruction of the Confederate States of America. 300,000 free black men are now wearing Union blue to emphasise the crusading nature that's taken over in this war. And the belated and fiercely resisted call from some Southerners to free and arm their slaves in defence of their former masters is, putting it politely, risible, and certainly too late to make a difference. Sherman captures Savannah as a Christmas present for Lincoln in 1864. And when he takes Charleston in February, he makes sure that 2 regiments of US coloured troops lead the march into the heartland city of the rebellion. Nice touch. At Petersburg, a last flurry of attacks brings Lee's army to absolute breaking point. And when the Union Army delivers its general assault on the 2nd of April, the great army of Northern Virginia just shatters to pieces. The idea that Lee's army could somehow escape to the southwest and join up with Joe Johnson in the Carolinas was pure fantasy. A fantasy that ended at Appomattox Courthouse with surrender on the 9th of April, and Joe Johnson would fold soon after. Now, here's a curious kind of nihilism that seems to have directed the fate of the Confederacy. This is Jefferson Davis writing in November 1864. This is after Lincoln's presidential victory has pretty much sealed the fate of the South. And Davis says, "There are no vital points on the preservation of which the continued existence of the Confederacy exists. Not the fall of Richmond, nor Wilmington, nor Charleston, nor Savannah, nor all of those combined can save the enemy from the constant and exhaustive drain of blood and treasure, which must continue until he shall discover that no peace is obtainable unless based on the recognition of our indefeasible rights." So this 4-year defence of the territorial integrity of the secessionist states, the dissipation of military efforts towards that goal, the outright refusal of some southern states to go to the assistance of their neighbours if it renders them open to invasion, it all seems to have been in vain. And this is my point. There was no general grand strategy guiding the Southern war effort once the chance of foreign recognition was ended. It is worth noting that the North, although very much stronger than the South, could deploy 81% of its military strength in its main field armies operating to a specific plan, whereas the South could only put 68% of its much smaller force up to oppose them. So once the North decided a course of action under leaders, military and political, that had turned the scene through, this great American tragedy had only one possible outcome. Thank you.